Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the latest Zoom offering from Leeds Theosophical Society. And this afternoon, I'm going to be looking at the times of transition, which we all know are unfolding at the moment. And the conversation preceding this talk was somewhat gloomy, and people feel this real tangible sense of gloom around the world at the moment. But the problem with gloom is that it is very contagious and very infectious. And it's important to remember that our individual consciousness is part of a wider collective consciousness, and it feeds into it. And so the world has a collective consciousness, which at the moment is not in a very healthy place. You know, it's often said mistakenly that prostitution is the world's oldest profession, but I don't think that's true. I think predicting the end of the world is the world's oldest profession. And there's a great long list and litany of people who've done that. So we are in times of major reformulation, both physically and on the inner planes at the moment. There is a whole reforming of humanity taking place, and that involves an intellectual uplift, which we've all seen in recent decades and centuries, but also, and this is most crucial, there is a spiritual uplift going on. And it's obvious to say that times of transition always are accompanied by turmoil, by conflict, by division and upheaval in all sorts of different forms. So I'd suggest to you that we're possibly at the most pivotal point in human history as far as we certainly understand it. This is a major turning point, certainly the most important point for perhaps the last 2,000 years. So let's look at exactly where we are, because one of the core things about theosophy, as we all know, is that everything is subject to cycles of one sort or another, short ones and very long ones lasting billions or even trillions of years. And we're familiar with these cycles, and we need to understand how each cycle is influenced by varying forces, energies. Some people call these the rays, but different influences which color that particular age. Now we're coming to the end of the age of Pisces and moving into the age of Aquarius. And obviously there's no clear agreement as to the timetable of all this. And that changeover period doesn't happen instantaneously, of course. It takes place over a period of hundreds of years, so that the influence of one age, the age of Pisces, gradually recedes and the energies of Aquarius begin to take over. And we're on the cusp of that somewhere at the moment. The Piscean age, of course, was ruled by the sixth ray of devotion. And this can be devotion to religion, politics, ideas, whatever. The incoming age of Aquarius is ruled by a very different ray. This is the seventh ray, sometimes called the ceremonial ray of magic and order, but it's a synthesis. It's a synthesis of all the incoming energies. So not only are we at the cusp of that cycle and that transition from the age of Aquarius, from Pisces into Aquarius, we're also at a very crucial part of a much wider cycle, the precession of the equinoxes. This is that 25,920-year cycle. That's normally the figure which is ascribed to it, in which the heavens make a complete rotation. That time is divided into 12 segments of 2,100 and something years. And so every time that this happens, every time there is an upheaval between these ages, there are going to be points of conflict. But crucially, we are perhaps halfway through this cycle. Some people say we're actually a complete rotation into this cycle. But wherever we are, we're facing a kind of a double transit point here. So where are we? If we look at the theosophical literature, that talks about cycles in terms of development groups of humanity called root races. And we are in the fifth race. We're in the fifth sub-race of that race. And we are also in the fifth branch race of the fifth sub-race of the fifth root race. That's where we are at the moment. And so there's all sorts of unprecedented which is going on at the moment. The Earth is also moving through the photon belt, which also occurs every 12,000 years. And we know that 12,000 years ago, there were tumultuous events on Earth, the Great Flood, the sinking of Atlantis, the reshaping of continents. So we are at one of those pivotal points in history. We've also seen other things which some of you will know more about than I do. 5 outer planets which will be astrologically changing sign, and recent planetary alignments as well. And also there have been significant changes to the Earth's magnetic and gravitational field. And some people say that this in itself is an opportunity for psychic and spiritual advancement. So we are at this crunch point, this absolutely crucial period in history. If we look at another cycle, the Hindu cycles, which we talk a lot about in theosophy, we are at some point in this Iron Age, this Dark Age, this Kali Yuga. It's not generally agreed exactly where we are in this, but this is a Dark Age, which eventually will pave the way for a much more enlightened time somewhere ahead. And I think this is what we have to focus on, because it's very easy to give in to all this kind of doom and gloom, whether that's politically or ecologically or financially or whatever it happens to be. We are shapers of our own destiny. This is what we believe in the ageless wisdom tradition. Yes, we are subject to these outer forces, but how we deal with them and what our response to them is absolutely crucial. And I'd be the first to admit that there are a lot of problems going on in the world at the moment. But this is partly to do with the Earth's collective karma. And certain writers have dealt with this at some length. For example, Alice Bailey spoke about how the First and Second World Wars, which she conflates into a single conflict, were all part and parcel of some major burning off of humanity's collective karma. And clearly, this is all playing out at the moment. The First World War was meant to be the war to end all wars, but it was not. It was just the first course in a long banquet, which is still continuing today. Do you know how many wars there are in the world at the moment? We only hear about some of them in Ukraine or the Middle East, or possibly in some of the African places. There are, according to the Geneva Center for Studies into this sort of thing, I forget its precise name, 110 wars going on in the world as we speak today. Well, there are only 200 countries. There are only 200 countries in the world, and yet we've got 110 wars. Do you know how much we spend on war each year? $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion. Well, I'm old enough to remember the days when $1 trillion was a lot of money. So, we have to think about what human priorities have become. And perhaps the events that are unfolding at the moment are a way of showing humanity that it does need to take a different course. It does need to change radically its agenda and what it sees as its priorities. And I think we who follow the ageless wisdom tradition in different forms, be it theosophy or similar organizations, we can actually play a part in this. We're not powerless. We're not powerless. We can spread positive ideas around the world. And I think 2025 is that crucial year. And a lot of people have been pointing to this. Apart from anything else, it's the 150th anniversary of the Theosophical Society, formed by Madame Blavatsky and Colonel Olcott way back in 1875, along with other people. And I think it's an important thing to represent this as a milestone, because theosophy, although it's never been about evangelizing things, it's never tried to twist people's arms and say, we have all the answers or anything like that. It has offered a much more panoramic and, in my opinion, persuasive view of what we are as human beings and what the cosmos is as well. I think it's done a fantastic job. Invisibly, quietly, behind the scenes, these ideas, which theosophy first proposed 150 years ago, have seeped and infiltrated into popular consciousness. People now talk much more about reincarnation and karma, which they knew nothing of even 50 years ago very much, but certainly not 150 years ago in the West outside a number of academic circles. Theosophy has reinforced this idea of the interconnectedness of life and the fact that everything in the universe, all the kingdoms of nature and everything, is conscious. It's just a place of consciousness. It's not a place. It's just a big thought. It talks about also how there's no dead matter or empty space. The universe is a very, very busy place. So certainly theosophy has really had an enormous influence on the scientific mind. It's had an influence on the arts and on wider culture. It's had probably a political effect, and it's certainly given birth to the New Age and the environmental movements which have been unfolding for the last 50, 60, 70 years. So invisibly and unseen, it has had this remarkable influence on world affairs without shouting about it too much. So I think this is something to celebrate. As an organization, and remember that the Theosophical Society doesn't own theosophy. It is simply a vehicle for disseminating it. And the society, in organizational terms, is going through a period of decline and difficulty. But the ideas themselves remain, and the Theosophical Society will evolve into another vehicle of some kind at some point. I don't know when, but certainly these ideas which it transmits are more important to humanity than ever, because these are things which can, I think, ensure our survival and prosperity into the future. You can see why people get very pessimistic, can't you? When we're just peddled on the news. And as a journalist, I take some responsibility for this, even though I don't participate in the mainstream media anymore. We get peddled and fed this continuing diet of war pornography and violent imagery. And there is a real problem now with young people, young men especially, consuming this violent imagery, be it in terms of pornography, violent games, or other material. And this stuff does poison people's minds. It really does poison people's minds, and it skews their perspective on themselves and on everybody else. So this is not the only cause of that, but it's just a symptom of the time that we live in. I've just written an article this week called The Connectivity Paradox, and this is about how intimately we are connected in terms of physical infrastructure, being able to travel, but also in terms of digital technology. And it seems to me there is a paradox. The more we kind of come together in some sort of enforced way, it's like that old saying, familiarity breeds contempt, and we're rubbing up so close to each other, and yet we're so alienated at the same time. The digital age of communication has paradoxically produced an age of alienation and loneliness. And this is quite hard to explain. It certainly can be explained by the law of unintended consequences when a communication system becomes its very opposite. We all know that so large parts of social media are just poison sewer, essentially, with people just throwing insults at each other. And the world is a very, very angry place. You've only got to walk down any street. If I walk down my local street here or any other part of the world that I visit, you see an anger which you didn't used to see. And sometimes this anger is actually quite invisible, but you can see it sometimes in people's behavior. There is a lot less politeness around in the world today. There is a lot less morality, ethical behavior. There is a less of an appreciation of things like truth and beauty and nobility of thought and that sort of thing. These are values which have departed. And as many esoteric writers before me have commented, when these things depart, that's when a civilization starts to crumble. Anyway, on a more positive note, 2025 is also important because in May, there is a very important event taking place amongst the hierarchy, the brotherhood of adepts who guide this planet, the hierarchy of adepts who are said to inhabit various places, including Shambhala, that ethereal place located somewhere in the region of the Himalayas. And in the 25th year of every century, there is a centennial conclave of these masters, of these adepts of the Brotherhood, in which they basically set the scene and look at the agenda for the coming century. And this led apparently to a number of changes when it happened in 1925. One of the things that is claimed to be on the agenda for this meeting at the time of the Wesak full moon in May is something that certainly Alice Bailey talked a lot about, which is the externalization of the hierarchy. That means the reappearance of the masters in physical form for the first time since Atlantean days, which obviously is 12,000 years ago at least. This figure of 12,000 keeps coming up again and again and again, suggesting that we are at the end of another 12,000 year cycle. And there are all sorts of other things happening accompanying this, which are not necessarily directly related to it, but which I think play a part in it. There is this, I don't know whether any of you are interested in UAPs, as they're now called. We used to call them UFOs, unidentified flying objects, extraterrestrial beings, captured alien technology. And there does seem, and has been over the last decade or so, this progressive kind of disclosure about all this. And I think this is playing, whether it's real, whether it's not, whether it's conspiracy or whatever it is, this also is playing into a change in popular consciousness. And it's gone from being something that's very fringe and kind of a bit nutty as it was in the 50s and 60s to something which is very, very prominent now. When you get former defense ministers in Israel and Canada openly stating that, yes, there is an agreement with various extraterrestrial races for cooperation and other things. When people of this stature say this, when pictures are released by the US military, and when there is massive interest in all this, half the people in China believe in the existence of these things. So this is all playing again into a kind of a ferment in popular consciousness at the moment. One of the things I really do think we should be very frightened about, and which we should do our best to resist is all this horrible, nightmarish transhumanist agenda. This really scares the hell out of me, and it scares the hell out of a lot of people. We don't need to be enhanced by silicon chips or exotic materials or implants or anything like that. Human beings have massive, massive inner hidden potential, and we've only tapped into a tiny little part of that. We've seen how our intellectual abilities have mushroomed over the last 2 or 3 centuries, especially. We have capacities, we have faculties we don't even know we have. And these are the ones that should be developed rather than this horrible, horrible notion that people can somehow be enhanced. Are they saying that human beings are not enough? Or are we just lumbering robots with wet computers as brains? Well, I suggest that we're far, far more than that. And it seems to me, I write a lot about, well, the benefits of technology, but also the large disadvantages that technology has brought us, our dependence on it, and in some cases, our extreme addiction to technology. You've only got to sit in any airport or bus station or anywhere. How many people are on their phones at any one time, just scrolling through stuff after stuff after stuff? It is a kind of an addiction. And it seems to me that the dark forces which do exist, certainly on the inner planes, they manifest on the outer planes, and they use this stuff. They use technology. I don't want to sound like some Bible thumping preacher or anything here, but these technologies are extremely dangerous. They can be extraordinarily beneficial. We can see to the furthest reaches of the visible universe. We can examine the most minute particles of matter, if that's what they are, or potentialities of matter. We've made huge strides in being able to cure diseases and heal people from catastrophic injuries. And technology has made many people's lives much easier. Before we had washing machines and electricity in our houses. However, this stuff should also be seen for what it is and what its potential is. We now have technologies which can annihilate all life on this planet. And there are a few individuals on this earth who are crazy and mad enough to want to do that. And so technology has to be seen in its context. Yeah, it's great in many ways. And without it, we wouldn't be sitting here this afternoon talking about these things. But I do think we need to caution about how quickly technology has advanced. When I look at how it's advanced in my own life since the 1950s, it's just immeasurable. When I was born, we were the only family in the street to have a TV set. And we only bought it so we could watch the coronation of the Queen. And all the rest of the street came in. But no one could afford to buy a television. You had to buy it on the hire purchase in those days. Whereas now people replace their televisions, 60, 70-inch things every 2 or 3 years. So technology and consumerism have, really changed people's lives during, certainly since the Second World War. But in recent history, we have undergone a huge increase in intellectual capacity, and technology has been partly responsible for this, starting, back in the 15th century with the first printing presses, which were the game changer of their age, allowing more people to be able to read for the first time. Similarly, in our own age, we've had radio, television, newspapers, more recently the internet. When they measured the IQ of recruits to the American Army in 1917 in the First World War, they found a particular figure, and it wasn't particularly high. When they measured them 30 years later or 25 years later in the Second World War, they found that there had been a significant shift in their intellectual understanding. And this was because more people were reading, there were cinemas, there was radio, many other means of communications. Now, many people these days, and it depends really on who you talk to, but people talk of us living in a spiritual dark age. And I can see why people say that, because there isn't all that much to get excited about in terms of humanity's wider spiritual progress. However, some writers do insist, Alice Bailey's one of them, but there are others too, that this spiritual uplift has been unfolding for some time. But when you look at the outward signs of this and how it manifests itself, it's difficult to understand that this is the case. So this needs to be, this needs to be really high on humanity's agenda. And we need to understand that perhaps the most important things that we do in this life are the work on ourselves. Because all of us here this afternoon are people who, one way or another, have chosen to accelerate their development in some way and try and move beyond the normal level or normal speed and pace of evolution. And anybody who chooses to do that is going to be faced with certain difficulties. People who are not spiritual tend to think it's some kind of cop-out or easy option, when in fact it's quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. It involves struggle, it involves effort, it involves putting in the time. You can't just go to some seminar with a wise guru, pay 500 quid and get a certificate at the end of it and become spiritually enlightened. It doesn't work that way. A lot of these gurus who charge £500 for a weekend think it does and convince people that it does, but it doesn't. And so it's only through prolonged self-effort that we are able to do this. And I think it's quite significant that a lot of people come to appreciate these ideas, not so much when they're young, although some young people do, and that's great, but it's often when people reach the midpoint in their lives or even later that they start to ask these questions about themselves and decide that they want to do something about it, that they can, that they have the freedom to do this. Because the important thing about theosophy, perhaps the most important thing about theosophy, is that unlike religions, it says that we are drivers of our own car. We are masters and mistresses of our own destiny. We're not subject to the whims of a sadistic God sitting up in the clouds wanting to punish us. We are very much in charge. We can make a difference if we choose to do that. The problem is that people, because of technology and because of other conditions, are less willing to put that effort in many cases. They don't, everything needs to be fed to them in bite-sized pieces. And I think this presents a huge difficulty. What we do is necessarily always going to be a relatively minority pursuit. But a lot more people now are starting to ask those questions that we all ask, why are we here? Where did we come from? What's the purpose of it all? Where are we going? What's the meaning of life? How does it all work? People are now beginning to ask these particular questions, and a new group of people is emerging, people who describe themselves as spiritual but not religious. This is a phrase that some people don't like very much, but I think it describes them. They are seeking wider answers than religion, or indeed science can offer them, because science in itself has become a kind of religion for many people. This is the hard materialistic science, which is sometimes called scientism, and which many people subscribe to. But growing numbers of people don't find these answers at all satisfying. Obviously, religions still have a great hold over people. They have many billions of adherents around the world, and they will continue to do that for quite some time. But I do think that we're going to see a few things emerging, and this has happened over the last 50, 60 years with the New Age movement, which takes a lot of its beliefs from various indigenous peoples around the world, including in Britain, Celtic, pagan, Wiccan practices, practices which are in harmony with the world and with nature, and which are not necessarily ruled by lots of ecclesiastical rules and regulations, religions which are much more personalized and much more real, and which are about worshipping tangible things in nature, the streams and the meadows and the woods and the forests and all those sort of things. So this is something which I think is emerging very much, certainly in the Western world, where people, and also you're seeing all sorts of different syntheses of existing religions coming together, particularly in places like South America, where you get indigenous practices seamlessly grafted onto Catholicism and producing a very strange but obviously satisfying blend for the people who practice these things. So religions aren't always the dead things that we think they are. They are malleable. And certainly events are happening within the Christian church. You've only got to watch the news and you'll see another sex scandal emerging, or another sex scandal which has been suppressed. We've had the former Archbishop of Canterbury on the news in the last day or two, talking about the scale of abuse within the Anglican Church. So these religions still have a huge grip on people, but you wonder whether over time there will be further reformations of Christianity and indeed other religions like Islam as well. Islam is 1400 years old, and it was at that age when Christianity went through a reformation, and many people have spoken about the possibility of something similar happening in the Islamic world. Another thing which has impacted on all our lives and made it such a unique time to be alive is not only the technological progress or the intellectual and possibly even spiritual progress, but it's simply the number of people who are here on this earth. When I was born, the population of the earth was round about 2.5 billion people. Now it's 8.2, 8.3 billion people. Well, that's more than a 300% increase in just over 70 years. And this is absolutely astonishing. And I spent many, many, many hours pondering on the possible esoteric explanations for all this. Why was there a need for a 300+% increase in the number of souls coming into incarnation in this particular period of time? Why was that necessary? As far as we know, that had never, ever, ever happened before at any point in human history. So why did it happen in this particular era? And when you think about it, it can only be that there were these number of people who needed to experience the unique circumstances that we have all seen in our lives, the huge changes to every aspect of our lives, which have unfolded. Perhaps we all needed, as part of our own development or indeed karma, to witness what it's like to live in a world where there is just perma-change all the time. Obviously, theosophy teaches us that nothing stays the same for a single moment and that everything is in a state of ferment and change. But obviously, there are limits, and people can only cope with a certain degree of change. And I wonder sometimes whether this amount of change that we've all witnessed over our lifetimes, whether this is causing this kind of mass psychosis on this planet, because there is a form of mass psychosis and certainly widespread mental illness, particularly alarmingly amongst younger people. You look at the number of younger people who don't or won't work because they claim they have mental health issues. So we're living in this world which apparently offers us so much, but which is also a very damaging place to be. And I think it's damaging because all these circumstances, particularly the technology, the materialistic mindset which we've developed over the last centuries, all this has really masked the big important question. And that big important question is who we really are. Who are we as human beings? What is our real makeup? And it's because of the wide-scale ignorance about all these things that I think that humanity now faces its present crisis. These answers, who are we? Where did we come from? What's the meaning of it all? These have all been questions that religions have tried to address and which have largely failed to offer satisfactory explanations for. Science says it's not its job to speculate on the whys of things, just the how. It's good at measuring things and collecting oceans of data, but it won't tell you why there was a Big Bang, if there was a Big Bang. It won't tell you why. That's the job of the philosophers, they say. So it's not our job to speculate on such matters. So what I'm saying is that underpinning all of this is a human identity crisis. And this is where theosophy and where similar traditions can really help in this, because at the core of what we believe is the fact that we are not just flesh and bone and brains and all blood and all the rest of it. There are other subtle dimensions to us. And similarly, there are hidden realms of being which exist beyond the physical plane of existence and which are not usually perceived by our physical apparatus, but which certain things can tell us are definitely there. Now, trying to explain these things to people, as we all know, is not easy. But I do think it's our job to, wherever possible, try to convince people, or certainly suggest to people, we're not in the evangelizing business, but offer to people the idea that they are more than just their physical bodies. They're more than their emotions, and they're more even than their thoughts. That's a big ask, but I do think it's important that people start to ask these questions, because when people's notion of their identity changes, then their perception changes and their very consciousness changes as well. They begin to behave and think in different ways. If people knew really who they were, that they were souls who just happened to be occupying a physical body at the moment, but at some point in the past and at some point in the future, they'd been occupying entirely different bodies, then I think that would make people's behavior change quite substantially. If we know that there is this law of cause and effect, the law of karma, if we know that everything sends out its vibrations into the universe, be it a word, a thought, a deed, whatever it is, that eventually will produce an effect at some point. And when we understand this, and when we understand it correctly, I think this would be the most important thing for humanity to understand. Indeed, Madame Blavatsky herself called it, I think, the law of laws, the most important law of reincarnation and karma, and teaching people about this continuity and continuum of existence. In the modern world, everything has to be achieved immediately, immediate gratification. Very few people take a longer term view. We don't do this in terms of our economic planning, our architecture, or any other aspect of life. It's strictly short term. And this is one of the dysfunctions, if you like, of a materialistic outlook. You never look beyond the nearest horizon. You don't think, how is this going to impact in the future in some particular way? So humanity is receiving a wake-up call at the moment in all sorts of different ways. Mother Nature is crying out, and there's all sorts of other symptoms which are unfolding in the world. You know, we live in times of poisonous politics. Talk to people in any country, and they feel more and more divorced from their politicians and their ruling class. It's not just in this country, it's everywhere you go. You see the same thing happening. So it's time for a revolution, really, in the way that we understand ourselves. Because when we do that, we can start to cooperate with each other in ways that we haven't done very much, certainly in recent times. And we can't continue to live on a war with on a world with 110 wars going on at any one time. And the only way we can do this is by using what we have, our mental apparatus, to try and reshape the world as best we can. So thank you all very much. I hope you all have an excellent week and don't slide into too much doom and gloom. And I hope we can all meet up again in a couple of weeks' time.